Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Women of the Word podcast. Jen, it's great to see you. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
Me too.
Awesome. Okay, so before we start, did you watch any of the Olympic Games this past summer?
Of course I did.
So
Yes.
did I. Always
Mhm.
super fun. Also, always very impressive. Most of the time, I watch and think, I could never. I could never.
For sure. Mhm.
So, one of the things that came from the Olympics that I found really funny was this series of videos on social media. I don't know if you saw any of these, where just like normal people would attempt something that is in the Olympics and they just failed really, really bad.
Yeah.
And they would like caption the video with this phrase, "I'm sad to say I did not make the Olympic team this year," which honestly, clever. I just thought it was so funny.
Grounding, one might say. Very
Yes,
grounding. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And while that is really funny, I think that there also is kind of a real principle in there that experience and expertise, they matter. They play a
Yeah.
part in our ability to do something well, and I think not everyone is an Olympian is what
Correct.
that taught us, and that's fine. But when it comes to experience and expertise, you, Jen, have been a Bible study leader, a teacher, a participant for a lot of years. You have experience and expertise in Bible study and leading a Bible
Mm.
study. So, what methods have you found to be most successful and which ones maybe haven't worked super well?
Yeah, so actually your analogy is great because it is true that there are always people who are going to be better at the balance beam than others, but not everyone is actually called to walk on a balance beam.
Yeah.
And we all are called to have balance, but we aren't called to walk on a balance
Yeah. I'm
beam.
grateful for that, though,
And
truly.
so, like, I would say that after, 25 plus years of ministry, I do have a level of experience that some people listening are not going to have. But I'm not an Olympian because the experience that I have is in the same area that we're all called to
Mm.
have a proficiency at. The Great Commission says that we're to go and teach others to observe all that Jesus has commanded. And so that's all I'm doing. I've just maybe been doing it a little longer or with a little bit more help that I've received than other people have, and that's why I just wanna pass that along to our listeners as well.
Yeah.
I do have experience in the women's Bible study space, and then I also have experience just in the adult education space, and in my final role at my church, I actually had responsibility for our next gen and family ministries as well.
Mm.
So I've spent a long time thinking about how to make sure that Bible literacy is happening not just in all female spaces, but in adult spaces and in children's spaces and student spaces too. And so that's what we're going to get to talk about across this season. But I do think, and we mentioned this a little bit in our previous episode, I do think that we can have a tendency to think that anytime people are gathered in a room and the Bible is opened, that we have studied the Bible. And so it's important to say that's not necessarily true. And that's what, if you listened to the first episode and you heard some of the statistics and the scary stories that we told, that's what we're seeing is that we can be well intended and we can sit and we can open the scriptures either alone or together and we can say we've had a study time. But a study time yields a learning outcome. It means that there was a purpose that at the outset and that what you did in the time that you used in between the beginning and the end was you attempted to accomplish that purpose. And so it's different than saying, let's just all sit down and have a discussion and see how it goes. It's different than sitting and just listening to a podcast or listening to a sermon. And we want to talk about how it's different so that when we set out to teach something with a learning outcome, we know the best way to get there.
Awesome. Great. So, how do we do that?
Well, first we need to define some terms. When I talk about like sitting and listening to a podcast or a sermon, those are obviously not bad things. Those are good things. I
Right.
myself have gained a lot from that kind of a setting. But those are what we would call a passive learning environment. That means that there's nothing really required of me before I receive teaching. I just have to hit a button or I have to come show up on a Sunday morning and sit down and someone has worked really hard all week long to prepare a message to deliver to me. But but the student is not really doing anything other than sitting and listening. And those you can learn things. The learning outcomes in spaces that are passive are not as sticky as those in settings that are active learning environments. So, really, the full terminology that I like to use is active, dedicated learning environments. And those two words, active and dedicated, are significant. So, a learning environment, somewhere where you have something that sticks with you when you're done. An active learning environment means that the student is partnering in the learning process. So, to borrow from the late, great Howard Hendricks, never do for your student what your student can do for themselves.
Mm.
And that means that it is not just expected, but it is necessary. Like it's part of the learning outcome for the student themselves to take up tools and to do some work before they hear someone do an explanation of what it is that they have been working on. And so the order is going to matter a lot in an active, dedicated learning environment. But active means student partners in the process. Dedicated means that space has as its highest goal learning. So, some of the other goals that might show up in spaces where people gather and open the Bible might be like, we want to build community, or we want to do service projects together. There could be all kinds of different reasons that Christians might gather and have a Bible present and have some form of discussion or something that are not strictly speaking about learning the Bible or theology. And what I have seen in the local church, particularly with the rise of the simple church movement, which was, about 10 or 15 years ago, is that in most, if not all, of our gathering spaces outside of perhaps the Sunday morning gathering, we have had as our highest stated goal that of building community. We've said, you know what, we're in a loneliness epidemic. What people need from the church is that we would have deep community with each other. I think it's a really important message. I think we should be building community in our churches. But if everything we do has that as its primary goal, then I promise learning has taken a back seat, like
Mm.
a back seat at the back of the bus. And if you've ever been in a small group, it depends on what your church calls it, a home group, a community group, a grow group, everybody's got their own name for
Yeah.
it. You know that they are really great places for having dinner, getting to know each other, having maybe an application-driven discussion around what the sermon was about or maybe a passage of scripture. But in terms of teaching something, they're not great. In fact, I would argue they're truly terrible. And that is because they're only going to be as strong as the person leading the group has a vision for having a learning outcome. And so, one of the reasons that we don't know doctrine and we don't know the Bible is because there has been a proliferation of this kind of group at the expense of other environments. And so, in some churches that have gone all in on the home groups model or the community group or whatever, there is the idea that anything that is not that group threatens that group.
Mm.
So, our people are so busy, they're only going to give us 1 hour a week or an hour and a half a week. And so, therefore, we're going to prioritize the building of community over everything else. And we're going to give them discussion questions, so they'll be learning. But the reality is they're not learning. And I'm starting to actually see more leaders awaken to this in the church. So that's encouraging to see. Not because I want to eradicate the community based gathering. I don't. I don't want to go to a church that doesn't have some mechanism like that. But because they're beginning to recognize that it can't be an either or, it needs
Mm.
to be a both and. And so when we even think about that shapes them, think about like student ministry. Well, you know what they need the most? They need friends. Well, yes, they do need friends, but they need more than friends. And so this is very much an act of reclamation. We need to do more than one thing. So once we've made learning the highest stated goal in an active, dedicated learning environment, it doesn't mean that we're going to say, therefore, please don't have community with each other. It just means that's not our first goal. Some groups that have done this well throughout the years have been things like, if you're familiar with Bible Study Fellowship
Mhm.
or CBS, where there's time for building community, and then that time stops, and now we're doing the learning,
Yep.
which, if you think about it, is the way that things happen in a school setting as
Right.
well. There might be chatter that happens in between classes, but when it's time to learn, we knuckle down and we learn. So it's inviting those spaces back into the local church. Many of us called this Sunday school back in the day,
Mm.
but maybe it doesn't happen on Sunday morning. Maybe your church can't support that. But is there a time, whether it's in the church as part of of their programming or in your home or wherever it is where you're saying this is a learning space. And then you have a set goal for what it is that you're going to do.
Yeah, yeah. I think that definition of the active, dedicated learning environment is really helpful. I think a lot of people will resonate with that. What are some of the elements of that?
Well, so there will be varying opinions on this. I'm going to tell you what I have found to work most effectively in my experience, and then you can weigh that and you can decide. But I like to call this the three-legged stool. And we actually have touched on this in, I think, in a previous season, but I just want to reiterate it here because now I'm hoping that people who are listening are going to think not just in terms of like a women's Bible study setting, but any setting where you're hoping that learning is going to occur. And the three-legged stool is first, it's studying on your own. So that's that never do for your student what your student can do for yourself. So there's
Mhm.
something required of you before you come and gather with other people. And then there's gathering in a small group setting with your peers to discuss what you're learning, with there be a leader, and we'll talk about that as the semester goes on. And then the third leg of the stool is teaching. So we've got individual work, group discussion, and teaching time. And I would argue that in most spaces, you want those things to happen in that order because in a good individual learning time, we're going to use that time to build dissonance in the learner, to help the learner feel what they don't yet know. And then you want them to go to their small group time and sit with other people who experienced a similar dissonance in their learning time. And then they all go into the teaching together after sharing whatever shared light they have, and they begin to feel that dissonance relieved or at least validated. And I think, when we talk about wanting to have long term learning outcome objectives, a student should not expect that every time they come and sit in the teaching time that all of the dissonance will go away because some of the things in scripture require us to wrestle with them for days, weeks, months, and years.
Mhm.
But that's the general flow of how the three-legged stool would work. And then my dear friend JT would add that there is actually a fourth leg to the stool. And I'm like, well, that makes it a chair and not a
Right.
stool. So you're not invited to my conversation. But he's not wrong. The fourth leg, to be fair, would be turning and telling, and this is something
Mm.
that you can find in education theory in school systems all across the country. You don't truly know something until you can tell it to someone else, and so, whereas that might not happen in the actual time that you're gathering together, it should be one of the learning outcomes that you could then go and tell someone else what it is that you have learned during that particular cycle.
Yeah, great. I think for our conversation today, we'll stick to the three legs of the stool. So let's maybe now look at each of those in a little bit more depth.
Yeah.
So, starting with that individual work or curriculum space or leg of the stool, if you
Mhm.
will, can
Mhm.
you maybe discuss in further detail what you mean by curriculum or individual work?
Yeah, so a lot of this depends on the nature of what you're trying to do. There can be different levels of work that are required of the student, the participant, depending on the nature of what's being learned. So, for example, when I first started teaching a women's Sunday school class in my church, it was not reasonable to expect those women to have done a curriculum before they came because, first of all, I didn't have time to write a curriculum, and we only had maybe 20 minutes for teaching. And
Mm.
so I had to ask the question, how can these elements be utilized, the three elements, in a way that made sense for the time that we had and the students who were coming to that space? So I just started saying, hey, before you come, read the passage that we're going to be in 3 to 5 times before you come. And then that way, when we got into the discussion based learning space that we had, they already came with questions. I'd say be thinking about what are your questions that you wanna ask, or what are your observations that you've made so that we can have a good conversation. I should have mentioned this when we talked about the 3 legs, that the smaller your group, the more likely it is that you won't have a formal teaching time. You will have a hybrid of a small
Mm.
group discussion and a teaching time. So, like in this space, or even when I taught in my living room for years, they had some questions that they would answer, or they had read through multiple times. And then when we sat down to have our time together, I was guiding the discussion and dropping in little bits of teaching that were relevant to whatever part of the discussion that we were in. But it wasn't like they had a small group time and then I taught them over what they had talked about in small group time. That is what it became the more the spaces I was teaching in got larger, because I would say that once a room gets past about 30, you've got to start splitting them into having an actual small group space. Otherwise, people are just, the quieter people are not going to speak up. The
Yeah.
louder people are going to dominate. Where are my loud people at? And so you just have to think about that strategically. But in the before work, it could be anything from reading through a passage repetitively, or maybe there are some questions that they need to think through that are loosely tied to something they've read through before. But then in a Bible study space, like for those of you who've done my Bible studies, you know that what I'm doing is I'm giving you a curriculum, like an actual curriculum that you're going to work through. And I'm crafting questions that are going to challenge your thinking. And I think that's what a lot of people will miss when they're thinking about pre-work. It's like women in particular, I think, have this mentality of, I need to get an A. You give me questions and I am going to get an A on those questions so that when I show up to talk about this, everybody's going to know I got it right.
I feel that very
Yeah,
deeply.
and the way I know this is the case is because people will email me and say, "What was the answer to question X in
Yeah.
week 3 of this study you wrote 10 years ago?" And one of the things that they're always wanting to know is like, "How did you answer the question?" Because I have a formulaic question of, "Knowing that God is blank shows me that I am blank, therefore I will." And it's supposed to, like, help people think about, like, what's true about God? What's true about me? How should I live in light of that? And for people who are new to the method, they're like, what's the right answer? They don't
Yeah.
recognize that the answer could be different based on the week you've had or based on, something that the Spirit pulled forward for you about God that was different from what your neighbor saw. And that the richness of the question is found in the different ways that people might answer it,
Mm.
and then bring that to a discussion space.
Yeah. Can I ask a follow-up question to that? I
Yeah.
think I personally resonate with that very deeply. I think that there maybe in like a dramatic sense, but
Mhm.
also in like a real sense, I think another way that I also desire to know if I answered a question correctly is the fear that I'm like being a heretic, or
Mhm.
like I might just not have understood, or I interpreted something incorrectly. And we've talked
Mhm.
about how to do those
Mhm.
things in
Mhm.
past seasons of the
Yeah.
podcast. But how would you like respond to somebody who kind of is like, sure, I understand that there could be a different answer based on lots of different things,
Uh-huh.
and that like I need to think about the spirit of the question, but also I don't want to be a heretic. Like I
Right.
don't want to interpret
Right.
things incorrectly. So how do you balance that? I kind of want to know it's somewhat right, but without needing the ability to be right, the main goal of the
Right.
question.
Right. Well, I don't want anybody to be heretics either. I mean, that's the whole reason we're doing this podcast. And the
Exactly.
question is, at what stage do you learn whether you're a heretic or not?
Mm,
And the thing that a lot of us are missing is a place to evaluate our own current thinking.
mm.
And so you have to take a risk on that. You have
Yeah.
to so a lot of the questions that I'll place in a curriculum will say, what do you think Paul means when he says X? Or what do you think is meant here by this? Well, you may think something completely wrong, or
Right.
you may be like, "I don't know, but here's what I think it might mean," like, just take a shot at it, like, give it your
Yeah.
best shot. But we all think because we're Christians that the Holy Spirit should just be able to tell us that so we can get the right answer, and that
Right.
if I show up with an answer that's half-baked or maybe even wrong, then is the Holy Spirit even indwelling me at all? And that's what we have to get past. I
Mhm.
mean, in the same way that when you are learning a foreign language in school, you're not going to get everything right all the time. The learning process is clunky in order to get you to proficiency. And the same thing is true of what we're doing in Christian spaces as well. You have to have a place where you are willing to hazard a guess, where you are willing to not feel ashamed if it's
Mm.
wrong, but to feel challenged and exhorted and encouraged that maybe other people in the group got it wrong the same way you did.
Yeah.
so that you're maybe not, oh, this isn't, I'm not the only one who is confused here. These are hard things. And if you're utilizing a good curriculum, the person who wrote it is thinking in those terms. They're
Mm.
asking, how do I create dissonance? Not just for the sake of someone feeling like they don't know what they know, but to prepare them for the aha moment when they're ready for it. And what you find happening a lot with passive learning environments is the aha moments don't have the impact that they should because the learner didn't come in with the fire alarm pulled. So like, what we did in our first episode is an attempt to create dissonance because I
Yeah.
wanted you to listen to the rest of the season. And when you heard some of the answers, some of the solutions, they really stuck with you because you really felt the need for them. And so, in an individual learning space, and even in the group discussion time, we want that kind of dissonance to be functioning. We want people to be looking at each other and saying, I've actually not given enough thought to this. I'm not really sure what the answer is. What did you think? Well, here's what I thought. Well, here's why I thought that, but I
Mm.
don't know. And then when you've gone through those in that individual time and then the discussion time, where in the discussion time, I do think there's shared light. I do think because this is revealing one of the biggest weaknesses in our discipleship patterns to date is that individual study time is completely inadequate for producing fully formed
Mm.
Christians by design.
Yeah.
We're supposed to be doing theology in community. We're supposed to be learning the Bible in community. So there is work that we do alone, but it should always be walking toward a group
Mm.
where you're going to talk about it. And then because we know that the Lord has given some to be teachers, we should expect that in that group, there would be someone who's qualified to teach so that the dissonance that has been raised can then be relieved
Mhm.
to the degree that it can be based on, the work that you've done. And if there is long-term dissonance that the student needs to feel, it's properly pointed toward and maintained. So if there's a big question that has been wrestled with by believers for thousands of years, we don't want to try to sum that up neatly. We want them to go ahead and feel that and go, yeah, you actually, that was the right answer was, I don't know.
Hmm. Yeah. So, in addition to creating this dissonance, helping individuals think for themselves
Mhm.
and wrestle with the text for themselves, what else would you say this individual work time is meant to help achieve?
Mhm. Well, a good curriculum or a good pre-work, whether it's like you've actually gotten a workbook or whether it's just you're sending out questions, it should be given with an eye toward what will be taught. And so what can often happen is people think that the three legs of the stool function well without any reference to each other.
Mm.
But what it really is it's a sequence. And so a good teacher doesn't assign homework that has nothing to do with what they're going to talk about in the teaching time.
Yeah.
But so often in Christian circles, we think, okay, now I'm just going to have fun with the teaching time. And so I gave them work to do because I felt like I should. And it covered a lot of stuff that I didn't want to hassle with. But now I get to go teach whatever seems most interesting to me. And I think some of this has happened as a result of we have such a high view of preaching in Protestant circles that I think sometimes the role of teaching can get confused with the role of preaching. And we think, I'm just supposed to drop in and show them what I know. And we think of it as like, I've prepared a lesson and now I'm going to deliver it to you. And we forget that the best teaching is always dialogic. And so, a teacher who's teaching dialogically, even if the room is too big for there to actually be a back and forth between them and the students, is thinking about what questions did they come in here with? Well, if you wrote the curriculum or if you spent a lot of time picking a good one, you know exactly what questions they're coming in with.
Yeah.
And so my first step in preparing the teaching is to work through the work that I had the student do, asking, what did they think was an easy question that actually had more depth to it? What are the questions that were maybe too hard to include in the curriculum, but that are essential to them understanding this particular passage? Because I definitely need to reference those. What's the question they were so mad that I asked because they did not know the answer and, they fought for it and they
Yeah.
still don't know what to think? I'm absolutely going to hit that one every time. And then I build my teaching around the work that they did and around what I'm pretty sure they came in from discussion time still either irritated about or curious about versus just, here are the things I wanted to talk about. And not only that, but I'm going to reference what they did the previous week and what they can look forward to in the week to come so that there's a cohesiveness to what we're doing. If you give them good work to do beforehand, if you're the person who's doing the teaching piece, they come with so much more eagerness and so much more focus to hear the teaching time because you've pulled the fire alarm. They
Yeah.
don't like feeling confused, and we shouldn't love feeling
Right.
confused. But I think what we forget is that is actually a sign that learning is beginning. It's not an enemy, it's a friend. And so once you realize, oh, I don't need to feel shame or embarrassment. I should be excited because now I know. Oh, I don't know this yet, but
Yeah.
with a little bit of work, I just might nail this
Yeah.
down.
Yeah. That's helpful. Okay. So let's move on to the second leg of the
Okay.
stool, the small group time.
Mhm.
Can you define what you mean by small group time? What happens in this leg?
Yeah, I jokingly say it's where we pool our ignorance, but it can be that sometimes. It can
Yeah.
be just a, "Okay, well, let's go through," and you don't necessarily depending on how much pre-work there was, you might not go through every question that they talked about, or that they did on their own, but you might. Or if they read through the passage repeatedly, you might start with like, "Hey, what words did you see coming up over and over again?" Just some basic things that they might or might not have annotated depending on the work that you've given them. And the person who is the leader of that small group time, so I'm going to make the assumption that we're talking about a group larger than 30 for a second. The person who's leading that small group time doesn't need to present as an expert. They need to be a co learner who can help guide the conversation. They're a co learner who knows enough about what's going on with the goal of the study as a whole and any individual week as a whole to be able to keep the discussion on track and to be able to move through enough of the issues that should have or already have raised dissonance to prepare the learner for the teaching time. And so I think, if we see this as disjointed and we don't understand that the sequence matters and that the second leg is not just a standalone, let's get together and talk, but
Mm.
it's actually a preparation for receiving the teaching, then you have a leader who has in mind, okay, well, what do I think is going to happen in the team? Maybe they know because they've had a leader meeting, but I do just like to emphasize that, and we'll talk about this as the season goes on. Too often, we make the bar too high for a small group leader. They think they have to be the teacher.
Mm.
Now, if you're in a room full of 12, the small group leader is you and the teacher is you in a lot of cases. But once it gets beyond that and you're looking at like, who can I get to help me with this? If you're the leader of the teaching environment, messaging to those leaders, hey, you're a co-learner and a facilitator helps them to go, okay, I just need to have done my own homework and I have a little more light than the people in my group, but I don't have to have all the answers. And I can say, you know what? That's a really good question. Let's wait and see if we hear about it in the teaching. And if we don't, we'll circle up next week and see what we could find on our own.
Yeah. So in addition to that facilitating time,
Mhm.
what else is the small group time meant to achieve? What's the end goal for that?
Well, again, you wanna stay focused on the work that's been done individually, and so it doesn't mean that you wouldn't have, like, an opportunity to share prayer requests or that
Mhm.
people can talk about what's going on in their lives, but it means that once you get into the discussion of the work that they've done, you're gonna be responsible as the leader to keep it from going on rabbit trails because there's a learning outcome at stake.
Right.
This isn't just about, I wanna share my story or I wanna talk about this other thing that came to mind. And we're going to talk about how to train small group leaders to manage this kind of a setting as we move through this season of the podcast. There is a real role for that leader to play in making sure that the learning outcome is accomplished. And it's not that community would be their highest stated goal.
Yeah.
And, the beauty of, like, women's environments for sure is they're gonna form community. We're not super worried about it.
Right.
It's getting that thought level discussion to happen, and that is
Yeah.
a word that I think matters as we talk about this small group time. It should be a thought level discussion. It
Mm.
doesn't mean that your feelings don't come into play. Our thoughts should connect to our feelings.
Yeah.
But the hard thing often for people in, as we said, a subculture of a culture that is not good at thinking critically is to guard that small group discussion space for thought level conversation.
Makes sense. So what happens if this leg of the stool is weak or missing?
Well, it can be that the teaching doesn't land the way that it should because the discussion time didn't talk about the work that was done in by the individual. So they're not prepared. They're going to not know what other people in the group answered. So they don't know whether their answer was way off from everyone else's or everybody was in the same place. And so a good leader is going to make sure that there's adequate time, like that the time doesn't get sabotaged by secondary discussions or considerations so that the teaching falls on willing ears. And the other thing that can kind of get lost is like when you sit in your small group, it's so funny in the spaces that I've served in the local church, these groups, they come into the teaching time together and they would sit, and the ones who were there the earliest would be like, okay, we are ready to hear what you have to say about, they'd be like all revved up and ready to go. But what is important is they were sharing that, because when they're all, wanting to know, we're still fuzzy on this, then when they all hear it together, then they share that forever. And you think about like a lot of your most powerful memories and a lot of your most powerful learning experiences are that.
Yep.
It wasn't just you alone. It was you and a whole group of people experiencing the same thing. And so that's what a really good small group space can do, is it's this shared aha moment, which is just solid gold.
Yeah, yeah. And like you said earlier, the Bible is meant to be studied in community. And
Yeah.
so it's just a really beautiful picture of that becoming a reality.
Yes,
So,
absolutely.
yeah. Okay, let's move on to the teaching time leg of the stool. Can you define what you mean by teaching time?
Well, I touched on this a little bit. It's not just whatever I feel like teaching on, or whatever was most interesting to me. Although I do think that the most compelling teaching is based on, like, you can tell that the teacher really was just blown away by the
Mhm.
content themselves before they tried to teach it. But a good teacher recognizes that every step, every leg is teaching, not just their part. And so they're thinking about, well, what was taught in the way that the curriculum or the pre-work was given, and then what was taught in the sense that there was, what were they learning together in that
Mhm.
in that small group space, and then now how do I layer onto that? Because there's that well tried and true saying, repetition is the mother of learning.
Yeah.
And so really what you're hoping is they've had 2 repetitions and now you're gonna give them a third, where you're gonna be like, "You saw in the homework, you saw," and that's what I'll say. If you've ever listened to my teachings and my Bible studies, I'm constantly referencing the work that they did on their own. And I'll even say, "I'm curious what you talked about in your small groups,
Yeah.
because here's what I would imagine was talked about." And of course, this is all from my perspective based on the many, many years that I taught in a living room, where I immediately knew how they had answered the questions that they had done, because they were saying it right to my, and you're like,
Yeah.
"Shoot, that is not what I wanted you to say." And so there's a lot that goes into knowing how to write the pre-work, that curriculum piece, and we'll have a chance to explore that more as we move through this
Mhm.
season. But the teaching time does not exist in isolation any more than the individual time or the group time does. The
Yeah.
teaching time is always referencing those 2 other spaces and recognizing that the whole thing, even though we have a teaching time, the whole thing teaches, and the more consistently those 3 things flow together, the more consistent the outcome will be.
Yeah. It could be obvious, but what is the teaching time meant to achieve ultimately?
So it's meant to relieve the dissonance that was created in the other 2 spaces, insofar as that's reasonable. It is meant to acknowledge where the dissonance cannot be relieved in the short term. It is meant to connect what has been learned in previous weeks to the current week. It's also meant to extend ideas that were introduced in the individual time and in the small group discussion time. So you may have introduced a topic for them to think about in the curriculum or in the pre-work that got fleshed out a little in the small group time. And now it's your chance to sort of drive the point home for them in the teaching time.
So, what happens if this leg of the stool is weak or missing? And missing might be only in a smaller group.
Mhm.
There's potential that in a larger group, this
Mhm.
is going to be something that already exists. So,
Yeah.
maybe you could discuss the weak part of it and the missing part of it separately.
Well, when the teaching time is weak, my definition of weak would be either that you just are not prepared, or that you did not prepare according to the first 2 legs. And so therefore the student sits in the teaching time, they can't connect it to the work that they've done. And what that communicates is, I actually gave you busy work.
Mm,
Like that, it didn't really matter. I felt like I needed to give you something to do on your own. But if you never talk about, so like say you have them read a chapter out of a Christian classic to shore up some of what you're gonna teach that week, and then you don't reference that at all, then they assume that you just gave them that because you felt obligated to give them some work to do. And so a weak teaching time doesn't refer back to the other two legs of the stool. And it thinks that what it's doing is independent of that or doesn't have to build on that. That would be my biggest weakness piece.
Mhm. Yeah. What would you say to maybe a smaller group when this is missing? There is no teaching time at all.
Well, it communicates that everybody's opinion is equally valid. You know, what you talked about, you're like, I don't want to be a heretic.
Yeah.
I totally agree. And the way that we avoid propagating heretics is that there is someone who bears both the responsibility and the privilege of preparing a teaching. They recognize James 3's words that those who presume to teach are going to be judged more strictly, and they carry that with them. But they also recognize the significance of, I think I have a little more light than the next person, and so I'm going to work really hard to make sure that I am bringing what is true and good and profitable into this space. And when you don't have that, you know, it's interesting. One of the things that's part of the greater culture right now is the death of expertise. We don't actually believe anyone is a bigger expertise on anything than any of
Yeah.
us are. Any pregnant mother thinks that she knows more about childbirth than her healthcare provider. She hands him her birth plan and tells him to he or she to execute it for her. You know, we think that we know more about skincare and about vitamins and about workout sessions, and you know, because we all go out on social media and become experts ourselves.
Mhm.
And I think there's a very real danger of that kind of an idea or attitude creeping into or not just creeping into, barging into the active, dedicated learning environment space within the church. And we believe that because I have the Spirit in me and I can read the Bible, and I had these insights on my own, my opinion is, or my view is every bit as valid as the view of anybody else's. In previous generations, we've called this the what this verse means to me syndrome. And
Yeah.
it can cloak itself in different ways, but it's when, you know, maybe you Googled an article that you thought was the best view and everybody disagreed with you, but you know what? Your article's better than theirs. And you need someone who's the teacher, someone who's running the show. You know, imagine if you had a classroom of second graders all weighing in on their views on subtraction tables. And someone needs to cut through the mess and go, I don't,
Right.
if I don't, just because you think that 5 - 3 = 6, you know, someone has to go, no, and then help people find a better way.
Yeah. Yeah. If someone listening to this is in a small group or a Bible study that does the first two pieces, they have
Uh-huh.
a curriculum or a study they're working through, they come together for small group time, but there is not necessarily a clear leader. It's
Yeah.
more focused on that small group time. And they are listening to this thinking, oh no, like I
Mhm.
don't have that teaching piece
Mhm.
and I don't really know how to move forward or like,
Mhm.
am I supposed to do something about that? What would you say to that listener?
Yeah, this is always a funny conversation for me because I know that my resources are used in a lot of churches with my head on a screen.
Yeah.
And I understand why. I mean, I have been the women's ministry leader who was looking for those kinds of resources, and I was looking for them because I didn't know who I had in my church who
Mhm.
could be the teacher. And the reason I produce resources like that is because I'm very well aware that is the case, and I recognize that deferring to existing teaching that's vetted and trusted is very useful, especially the smaller your group is, especially like if you're in a living room,
Yeah.
where you know what, I can facilitate a discussion, but I'm not ready to teach yet. In the local church, where you have a larger group of people, my gut is that there's a woman there who is dying to teach or who doesn't yet know that she can do it, but
Mhm.
she, you know, she has some interest. And I think it's our job to be looking for who that is. And I recognize that heads on a screen teaching can be a stopgap. They can be a place to start, but I don't think they're a terminus. And so I think that we should be actively asking who's the person who is an embodied, living, breathing person
Mhm.
in our church community who may not be there yet, but who could get there, and then how do we resource that person? And some of, you know, like my experience would be that I could take a resource such as the ones that I now create, and I could use the curriculum because I didn't know how to write a curriculum yet, but I eventually would have opinions on it. And then when it came to the teaching time, I could put together my own teaching structure the way I thought it should go. And then I could listen to the teaching of the person who had crafted the whole thing and read commentaries and piece it all together so that I knew the learning outcome that the person who'd written the curriculum was going for, and I could honor that, but also bring my own skill to bear. And so I think a lot of people think when you take on the teaching task that you're supposed to start with a blank sheet of paper, and just
Yeah.
kind of ask the spirit to tell you what to say. And it's not that, right? It's getting good teaching from people who've gone before you and then taking it into the space that the Lord has given you.
Yeah. As we wrap up our conversation today, why do you think that this three-legged stool method will increase Bible literacy?
Well, I don't think it, I know it. And that may sound super sassy, but I've just done this long enough
Yeah.
that I'm not guessing. I'm just not guessing anymore. And is it the only way? No, it's probably not the only way, but I will tell you it is a very effective way, and it is a pretty simple thing to implement relative to some of the ways that might be suggested. And that's what I think I like about it is the simplicity of it. And which is not to say that it's every piece, every leg of the stool is easy,
Mhm.
but it is a simple
Yeah.
strategy that if we'll talk about other things that are necessary for this to go well.
Yeah.
It doesn't just boil down to going, okay, I'm going to do these three things. But these three things are just a very basic, tried and true, don't reinvent the wheel,
Yep.
just do what's been done method, not just to Christian education, but to education.
Mm.
Like this is, if you were to enroll in a class at your community college, guess what it's going to have? Personal study time, group discussion, and teaching.
Yeah.
So it's just saying this is not just how Christians learn, this is how people learn. And then let's take the spoils of Egypt and put them to work for the Lord.
Yeah. Well, Jen, this was a great intro to the three-legged stool. Over the next 3 weeks, we're going to take an even deeper dive into each of these three components: the individual time, the small group time, and the teaching time, and joined by special guests. So get ready for that and be sure to join us, and we'll see you then. Thanks so much, Jen.